Red Bull's Formula One history is a blur of blue, red and yellow liveries, World Championship glory and Adrian Newey genius. That makes it difficult to differentiate between the classics, the dogs and the merely good cars it has produced. But the race is equal to that challenge, and we have ranked all 19 of its F1 cars from worst to best. This is not only based on the obvious metrics such as championships won and race victories, but also the pace relative to the rest, their significance in F1 history and their place in the Red Bull F1 story. The result is an order that contains a few surprises, showcasing what Red Bull has done right and wrong over the past 20 or so years. 19. Red Bull RB2. The 2006 RB2 was the first true Red Bull designed fully under the energy drinks giant's ownership, but also the worst. Adrian Newey arrived in February that year, too late to salvage a car he described as having poor downforce, handling badly and plagued by gearbox unreliability. While Newey focused on the longer term, Red Bull battled to get the best out of the car. Pre-season running was limited by overheating problems leading to bodywork changes that cost performance, while the switch from Cosworth to Ferrari engines didn't yield the expected benefits. In fact, the lack of development steps for the Ferrari customer engine meant binning off that deal to Toro Rosso and landing a Renault supply was a Newey priority. The car worked reasonably in slow corners, allowing David Coulthard to take third at Monaco, but it struggled in the faster stuff and only scored points 7 times. 18. Red Bull RB11. Having made a shaky but race-winning start to the V6 turbo hybrid era in 2014, Red Bull regressed alarmingly in 2015 with a troubled RB11. The primary problem was the Renault engine. Not only did Renault fail to make the performance gains anticipated, but it was also unreliable. There were drivability problems in the first half dozen races in particular, and engine development progress was also too slow. However, there were also car weaknesses beyond those caused by the need to make setup compromises to compensate for the lack of power. F1 tweaked its regulations in 2015 to eliminate the unsightly noses of the preceding years, but it wasn't until race 5 in Spain that Red Bull's short-nosed design was successfully crash-tested and ready to race. It took further mid-season upgrade packages to get the car working as anticipated and give drivers Daniel Ricciardo and Daniel Kvyat confidence behind the wheel. Over the second half of the year, the Red Bull RB11 was generally the third quickest and at its best on low-speed tracks. But it wasn't fast enough, as the team endured a winless season for the first time since 2008. 17. Red Bull RB3. The 2007 Red Bull was the first entirely conceived under the technical leadership of Newey, but despite the switch from Ferrari to Renault engines, it wasn't very successful. Behind the scenes, Red Bull was still growing with major investment in its infrastructure, but on track the car was erratic. It could be fast, especially in the wet, but there were also weekends where it was nowhere. Newey pointed to reliability problems hampering the development of a car he felt was a solid base aerodynamically and mechanically. The high point was the European Grand Prix weekend at the Nürburgring, where Mark Webber finished third and David Coulthard fifth, but that was one of only 6 races in which the RB3 scored. 16. Red Bull RB13. The 2017 switch to high downforce cars presented Red Bull with a huge opportunity, one it catastrophically squandered. The RB13 won 3 races but also proved unreliable on top of its perennial problem during the middle 2010s of Renault engines being down on power. And it had aerodynamic problems. The increase in car width from 1.8 to 2 metres led to the quality of Red Bull's wind tunnel data being compromised by the car being closer to the walls. The result was a poorly balanced car, further compromised by having to run less downforce to compensate for the lack of power. During this period, Adrian Newey had taken a step back from day-to-day involvement, but he was tasked with overseeing upgrades that turned a car that was as much as a second and a half off the pace early on into one that was more competitive and better balanced later in the season. An upgrade at the Hungarian Grand Prix that changed the side pods and diffuser transformed the car and made it significantly better in the slower corners, but it was never close to being a championship threat. 15. Red Bull RB1. The first Red Bull F1 car wasn't, strictly speaking, a Red Bull. Yes, it had the name, but this car was largely the product of design work done before Red Bull bought the underachieving Jaguar team. The Cosworth engine wasn't the most powerful, the car was middling at best on downforce and a little draggy, but it was solid enough. What was really impressive was how much Red Bull got out of it. The team was aggressive in extracting that performance. As team principal Christian Horner said, work was done to transform the aero balance and weight distribution. In the first half of the season, the RB1 was a consistent point scorer, but results became patchier as rivals got their act together later in the season. But it exceeded expectations and proved Red Bull wasn't the no-hoper some viewed it as. 14. Red Bull RB16. The The RB16 was hugely successful in its B-spec manifestation, but we'll come to that later. In its original form, it was a disappointment. While Mercedes dominated, Red Bull won just twice. The first victory came in the 70th anniversary Grand Prix at Silverstone, where Mercedes suffered from rear tyre blistering, although Max Verstappen's victory in the Abu Dhabi finale was on pace. Correlation issues meant that the team struggled to get to grips with the car. It also proved difficult to make the car work well across a wide range of corners. Early in the season, there was what Chief Engineer Paul Monahan called a split between the high and low speed corners. Red Bull gradually got on top of this, although the car continued to have a weakness in the entry to medium speed corners that was mitigated but never eliminated. It was not an easy car to drive. The team was confident the car was fundamentally sound, but couldn't make the changes during the season needed to exploit that potential, given it required modifications to the architecture and the lack of time in the condensed COVID-19 delayed season. 13. Red Bull RB12. The Red Bull RB12 was second best in 2016, which doesn't sound too bad until you consider it won only 2 races and finished almost 300 points behind Mercedes. The RB12 was visibly an evolution of the unsuccessful 2015 car, but with significant repackaging, in particular of the front end. It also featured an improved Renault power unit that was only giving away 20 brake horsepower to the standard-setting Mercedes by the end of the year. This allowed it to win twice, with Daniel Ricciardo only being denied a Monaco victory by a pit stop blunder. Chief Engineer Paul Monahan characterised the RB12 as very nicely balanced from the start. That remained the case even as the rate was increased as the year progressed. The car's 2 victories came in Spain, where Max Verstappen won on his Red Bull bow, and Malaysia, where Ricciardo triumphed after Lewis Hamilton's fiery engine failure. The RB12 at least got Red Bull back to winning ways, but it was still a long way off being a strong enough all-round package to threaten Mercedes. 12. Red Bull RB10. The introduction of the 1.6-litre V6 turbo hybrid engines in 2014 brought Red Bull's first spell of dominance to a juddering halt, and the responsibility for that lay firmly at the door of engine supplier Renault. Pre-season testing was a painful affair with all sorts of problems with burning bodywork that wasn't down to a cooling problem, but mechanical failures that caused fires. Red Bull managed around a third of the mileage of pace-setter Mercedes. Red Bull performed miracles to allow Ricciardo to finish second in the Australia season opener, only to be disqualified for exceeding the fuel flow limit. As the season progressed, the Renault engine improved in terms of power and reliability, and Red Bull won 3 times. However, the victories for Ricciardo in Canada, Hungary and Belgium were all on weekends when dominant force Mercedes had problems. The lack of exhaust blowing due to rule changes meant the car lacked grip in the corner exit phase, which made life difficult for Sebastian Vettel in his final Red Bull season. But overall it was a decent car aerodynamically. 11. Red Bull RB14. While the RB14 only finished third in the championship, it was Red Bull's most convincing car since the introduction of the V6 turbo hybrid engines. It went toe-to-toe with both Mercedes and Ferrari on occasions, winning 4 races. The car was a significant departure from its predecessor, the troubled RB13 of 2017. It featured an increased wheelbase and greater rake. The old problem of the weakness of the Tag Heuer badged Renault engine was still a limiting factor, and the Red Bull was generally at its best on less power-sensitive circuits. The fact the car carried a little more drag than its main rivals also contributed to this. However, the RB14's prodigious development rate meant that by the end of the year it could still be relatively competitive even at less favourable tracks. The car is significant as it marked the beginning of Red Bull's path back to title-winning success 3 years later. 10. Red Bull RB4. The Red Bull RB4 makes the top 10 despite being a bit of an embarrassment for Red Bull Racing. Not because it was terrible, but because junior team Toro Rosso beat it to the honour of taking the first victory for a Red Bull design in F1. This was at a time when customer cars were allowed, so Toro Rosso used essentially the same car, something that was outlawed 2 years later. Toro Rosso even finished ahead in the championship with its Ferrari engine version of the RB4. There was, of course, a big positive to this because Red Bull had designed a winning car, and the main team halved the performance deficit to the front and made big reliability gains. The aerodynamic concept was not dramatically different to the 2007 car, but there were major mechanical changes. This allowed the weight distribution and the aerodynamic centre of pressure to be moved further forward. The car proved particularly good in fast corners, allowing Mark Webber to qualify on the front row at Silverstone, where the RB4 was the quickest of all through the ultra-fast Copse corner. While it took just 1 podium finish and managed only 7th in the championship, the RB4 was the car that acted as a stepping stone to Red Bull's first era of dominance. 9. Red Bull RB15. The Red Bull RB15 started 2019 around a second off the pace, but it made dramatic improvements over the year. The car featured an innovative multi-link upper wishbone in the front suspension, which allowed greater ride height control with steering lock applied. But while that worked well, there were aerodynamic problems. What chief designer Paul Monaghan described as a large aero shake-up happened across the first part of the season that transformed the way the car worked. In particular, it was front wing tweaks, culminating in a minor end plate change in Austria that transformed the car, vastly improving the balance and setting it on a path that meant it had a very strong end to the season. That turned the car into a winner, taking the first victory of Honda's return to F1 in Austria. Max Verstappen added further wins in Germany and Brazil to cap a landmark first year for the Red Bull-Honda partnership. 8. Red Bull RB8. The Red Bull RB8 was initially knocked back in terms of pace compared to its successful predecessor by rule changes limiting the geometry of the exhaust exits. These demanded the exhaust must face rearwards, with the position, diameter and angle of the final 100mm of the pipe tightly mandated. Red Bull initially planned to use duct to recreate the exhaust-blown aero effect, but this was not considered legal. That led to the introduction of a Coanda effect exhaust late in pre-season testing. It wasn't until mid-season and a new bodywork package introduced at the European Grand Prix that the car worked as well as it should have done. This used exhaust gases to pull the airflow over the top of the side pods that could then be directed to the diffuser sides. After a patchy start, the car became a regular winner in Vettel's hands as he could use the exhaust blowing effect to balance up oversteer. And the car was robust too, as proved when Vettel sealed the championship in the Brazil finale despite his first lap clash with Bruno Senna's Williams, narrowly defeating season-long rival Fernando Alonso. 7. Red Bull RB16B. So why does the Red Bull RB16B get its own entry when it was just an evolution of the only modestly successful 2020 car, thanks to the requirement to carry over most of the design in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic striking? Well, it's because it was a dramatically different competitive proposition, thanks to a combination of regulation tweaks and shrewd changes by Red Bull. Rules-wise, floor regulation changes the FIA said were to prevent downforce levels growing and overstressing the unchanged Pirelli tyres played against low-rake Mercedes and therefore favoured high-rake Red Bull, but the car still needed to be improved. Newey and Red Bull opted to use its limited upgrade tokens to change the gearbox casing and therefore the rear suspension. That allowed Red Bull to adopt a Mercedes-style swept-back rear suspension that increased the potential for downforce generation at the rear. This meant it could produce prodigious amounts of downforce, albeit while carrying a little more drag than title rival Mercedes thanks to its high-rate concept. There were also Honda power unit changes that improved packaging and performance. This turned the car into one Max Verstappen took to his first World Championship, albeit with Red Bull missing out on the Constructors' crown. 6. Red Bull RB9. We've already talked about the problems of the Red Bull RB8 of 2012. Well, the RB9 of 2013 was the fully realised version of the car, and it utterly dominated. The car retained the high-rate concept Red Bull had increasingly exploited over the previous years and featured a Coanda effect exhaust that energised the brake duct winglets and the diffuser sides. It also had a sidepod undercut very deliberately profiled to act effectively as a duct and was designed with a great mastery of vortex generation. In short, this was the peak manifestation of the cars produced under the 2009 to 2013 regulations cycle. There were occasional tyre degradation troubles, something Red Bull tried to pin on the car being too fast for the tyres, but overall it dominated the season, in particular after the August break when Vettel racked up 9 consecutive wins. That run of success was partly down to pushing on with development, while main rival Mercedes focused more resources on its 2014 rule change car. 5. Red Bull RB6. The 2010 Red Bull RB6 was the team's first championship winner and brought the exhaust-blown diffuser back into F1. Newey's first port of call when it came to working on that was asking engine partner Renault to dig out the work it had done on engine characteristics with Williams almost 2 decades earlier. Fundamentally, the car was an evolution of the Red Bull RB5, which we'll come to in a moment. It was therefore the first, and thanks to the subsequent rule changes only, Red Bull designed fully around the double diffuser. The car was lengthened, with the rear suspension featuring an extreme angle for the front leg of the rear lower wishbone. That, along with a narrower gearbox, increased the potential for downforce at the rear. To add to that, the exhaust blew into the side of the diffuser, making it massively more effective in terms of producing downforce. The car won 9 races, but was comfortably the best of 2010 and should have added many more victories, but for unreliability and the infamous Turkish Grand Prix collision that wiped out warring teammates Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber. Having already clinched the Constructors' Championship, Vettel's victory in the Abu Dhabi finale earned him his first driver's crown. 4. Red Bull RB5. The Red Bull RB5 didn't win a championship, but it could have done. And had the double diffuser been ruled illegal, as Newey felt it should have been, it surely would have. The skinny aerodynamic rule changes of 2009 created the opportunity for Red Bull to make a big leap forward. And the RB5 was the most radical of the 2009 cars, more so than the famous Brawn. The car featured pull rod rear suspension, a geometry that had fallen into disuse in F1. This was a move designed to optimise the potential for downforce production at the rear. A lowered gearbox combined with this to help lower the centre of gravity. The car also featured an innovative nose with reduced area thanks to its U-shaped top and bottom surfaces. It was outstanding in fast corners but less nimble in slower turns, benefiting from an unprecedented development rate, including introducing the double diffuser for the 6th race of the season at Monaco, a change that required the repositioning of the front and rear suspension. The car was a front-runner throughout the season, despite not taking as many victories as it should have done due to unreliability and driver errors. The car won 6 races, including Red Bull's first win in China, and was, on average, the fastest across 2009. And that's what makes this car so important, as it laid the foundations for Red Bull's first era of dominance. 3. Red Bull RB18. Red Bull utterly nailed the new ground effect regulations introduced in 2022, with a car that also laid the foundations for its record-breaking dominance the following year. Newey's knack for understanding how to balance up the complicated performance equation played a key role in this. Given Red Bull didn't have many problems with porpoising, it's significant that Newey's design focus was on the suspension. Significant improvements were made over the season, with a reduction in weight vital, doubly so given it allowed the weight distribution to be shifted rearward to create a more responsive car. That built on the strengths of a car that started out already very quick, particularly in a straight line. The RB18 was hugely successful in its own right, winning 17 out of 22 races, but only taking 8 pole positions, given Ferrari was often the faster over a qualifying lap. The 2023 car was a direct evolution of the RB18, with mechanical tweaks and a significant step forward in terms of aerodynamic performance that made it utterly dominant. 2. Red Bull RB7. The Red Bull RB7 is too often forgotten, but of all the team's cars, the dominant 2011 machine has the best average in terms of single lap pace. It only failed to set the fastest lap of a race weekend once, in Korea, where McLaren driver Lewis Hamilton took the only non-Red Bull pole position of the year. The RB7 was the peak of the exhaust-blown diffuser cars thanks to an upgrade introduced late in testing. This placed the exhaust exits low down just inside the rear tyres. Both cold and hot blowing could be called on, with hot blowing created by retarding the ignition, allowing the gas flow to be maximised when the driver didn't need the power at the wheels but was still hard on the throttle. This meant tremendous rear stability. Newey also hit on the idea of repackaging the KERS batteries inside the gearbox bell housing. That cost it around 40% of the energy and often meant it overheated, but with the extra power always there for qualifying laps and the start. This well-packaged car proved untouchable, and Sebastian Vettel's mastery of driving exhaust-blowing cars meant he was a dominant champion. 1. Red Bull RB19. The Red Bull RB19 has to be number 1 through its sheer dominance. It won 21 out of 22 Grand Prix in what was, by many statistical measures, the most dominant season in World Championship history. However, in terms of innovation, it was, as Newey put it, a very close evolution of the RB18, meaning it owed its success to the foundation of the 2022 car. The RB19 produced the most downforce across a wide range of ride heights, was stunningly fast in races, even though front tyre warm-up trouble sometimes meant it wasn't the best in qualifying, and was strong on the straights thanks to being able to run less wing thanks to the effectiveness of its underfloor. It also featured prodigious anti-dive on the front suspension and, thanks to adding a structure to the top of the gearbox to mount the front legs of the upper wishbone to, anti-squat at the rear. And Red Bull dominated with limited development, most notably 2 packages modifying the side pods first in Azerbaijan, then in Hungary. It followed the lead of the RB18, but did so to brilliant effect.